running with what I think is a really important topic, but I think it's also something that people have trouble embracing and talking about, which is maybe why we want to talk about it, because we keep running into it a lot. It's this notion of accountability. And I've said this several times over the years that I feel like perhaps there's a generational difference when it comes to this word. I feel like older generations had this notion of, yes, I want it for everyone else, but I don't want it for me. And I feel that for sure. And then I do feel like there's been a generational shift, and maybe where our generation, Kim, is somewhere in the middle, but I feel like the younger generation have taken this word and they've claimed agency for the way that they feel this word. And so I think agency is more of that personal accountability. And so I don't know. So today I wanted the three of us to talk about personal accountability and maybe what our beliefs are on why this is so challenging for people to not just accept or embrace, but to actually become effective with the notion. And so that's kind of where I wanted to start and dive into today. So I guess my first question to you guys is, what's your relationship to the word, and or maybe it's been a journey, and how you feel about the word?
This is a good topic. I like this topic. Ariana, do you want to start?
I can. So from my perspective, from a coaching perspective, I don't necessarily use the word accountability, because it does have sort of a negative connotation to it. I think that it sounds, like a tangible thing, and especially when selling coaching or talking about coaching, it sounds like, well, I want an accountability partner. I would like for you to hold me accountable, and so on and so forth. But I think it's a very loaded word. Just because the way that I approach accountability is taking responsibility and staying in integrity with oneself, or keeping a word for someone else. So if I said I was going to show up for the 2:00 meeting, I will be there. And the people who are on the call are probably expecting me to, and therefore, there's accountability there, that I'm going to show up. And so what it all starts with when we look at the individual is, when we say we will do something, are we actually going to do it? And if we don't, is that going to mess up our trust with ourselves? And so the example that I use here is, and I don't know if this is probably a little bit off, but if I'm planning a date with a friend and I haven't seen in a while, and I tell them I'm going to be there at 2:00 and I'm going to show up and we're going to have lunch and I'm going to bring this and this and this. And 2:00 rolls around next week and I don't show up, well, the friend's probably going to be pissed. They're going to be upset, and they're going to be like, oh, well, wait a minute. They said they would do this and they're not, right? So it chips away at it's something we call integrity, right? Same thing happens for individuals. So if with the people that I work, and they say they will do magic time, or they would do a recovery time at 12 p.m. every day, and they set it as a block on their calendar. Well, 12:00 rolls around and they're supposed to do the recovery, or maybe even a task for work, right? They're setting up these structures and these accountability structures for themselves. Rolls around and they don't do it. They don't do it once, they don't do it twice, they don't do it 3 times. Well, now you have broken trust with yourself and with your higher self. And so this becomes a habit. It becomes something like, I'm really not showing up for myself. I'm not holding myself accountable for the things that I said I would do. And so this is not something that people do on purpose. This is just, again, a pattern that we can get into. And from individual patterns, this can also really bleed into the organizational pattern, right? Because then it becomes something that we just do as a culture. And so the step one is really taking inventory of, how often am I doing this? How often am I not showing up for the things that I say I will do?
I want to come back to some things you said, but Kim, I want to hear your reaction to the first question first.
So It's interesting because the word accountability doesn't bother me at all. I think this is a little bit, Whitney, what you are sort of referring to, right? Is for our generation, I think accountability is sort of something that it's not a word that we even think to question, because for me, when I think about it, it's being my word. And so when I just equate it as that's what it is. And I was brought up with this very strong message of like, your word is who you are. And so, when I think of accountability, I think of it in terms of, as you said, Ariana, holding myself responsible for the things I commit to, doing what I say I'm going to do, being my word. And I think that's important in a personal context, and then also in the organizational context. I think where it gets tricky is the idea of, not that it's easy to hold yourself accountable, but I think when we try to hold other people accountable, that's when people get really prickly, right? Because it's like, why are you trying to tell me what to do? Why are you trying to make me do X, Y, or Z? And even if it's just a matter of sort of holding the bar and saying, look, you agreed to do this thing and you're not meeting this thing, it feels oppressive in some way. And so I think that's the rub, and where the word gets its bad rap.
And so if the bad rap or those negative feelings, because I agree with Ariana's statement earlier that it feels like a loaded word, or at least I feel like when we talk with people about it, it seems emotionally charged. It seems like a word that's very emotionally charged. It tends to not be very positive, but I'm sure there are instances of that. But I think marrying what the two of you just said, it seems like there's a relationship with trust. So either you're breaking your own trust if you're scheduling these things for yourself and trying to hold yourself accountable, and you're not following through. So then you're kind of violating yourself. And when you're not showing up to that meeting or with that friend or whatever it is, you kind of have, to your point, chipped away at a little bit of the trust there. It's like, wow, okay, I thought we had a clear plan. We committed, we said what we were going to do, and then not do it. So I think accountability and trust must have a lot of overlap here. And that's really critical in these organizations. I mean, trust is so big. So maybe there's something with accountability and trust that is worthy of exploration.
And I think another thing that comes to mind too with accountability is autonomy. So what are we saying yes to being accountable for? So that goes back to clarity of, if someone asks us to do something and we don't want to or don't feel like we should be doing that, but yet we're saying yes to it, and we keep saying yes and yes and yes, so then our list of accountability things is getting really long, and then all of a sudden we might feel some resentment and loss of autonomy and even maybe some burnout, right? Then we are less likely to follow through, and it might not feel good for us in our bodies. Maybe it's not a hell yes, I'll take responsibility for that, but I'm saying yes because I want you to like me and I want to be a good employee, and I'm not really voicing what I need to be saying. So there's a little bit of alignment there too. And I think that's why for some people accountability can be really hard to say yes to, or might be loaded.
Yeah, I love that, because I was thinking about this. First, I want to go back and say your word of using responsibility instead of accountability, I actually prefer that. I think that's a much better word.
Right.
Because I think it is essentially the same thing, the same concept, but responsibility feels like it's giving more autonomy, and it does feel less oppressive. But to your point, I think that probably what contributes to the negative feeling we have about the word accountability is that honestly, people have a hard time having these tough conversations, right? So let's use your example. Let's say I say yes to something that's actually not a yes for me, and I put it off because I don't really want to do it. Ideally, I would say early on, you know what? I actually committed to do this thing, and it's not really something I want to do. So can we shift things so that maybe it's not on my plate, or someone who really does want to do it can do it. Or somebody says to me, hey, Kim, you said you were going to do this thing, but I don't really see you moving on it. Is this really a yes for you, or do we need to make an adjustment? But these conversations don't happen, right? Because they're super uncomfortable. So we wait until there's a deadline, or something has happened, or we say we're giving somebody all the time and all the leeway, and then they don't get there, and we're freaking upset. And that's when we're like, you said you were going to do it and you didn't do it. Right. And now I'm going to hold you accountable. And so it feels very strong, as opposed to if we just dealt with it along the way, it might feel completely different.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And for the person who isn't showing up with what they said they would do, right? They're probably saying yes to so many things, and the list of commitments that they're breaking is growing. And so they probably feel like they're so behind, and
Right.
their nervous system and their integrity and all the things it's really chipping away at it, right? So they're blocking energy within themselves. So they feel like they need to make up for all the commitments that they've said yes to, but they haven't shown up for, right? And so that's when you're so right, Kim. It just needs to you need to sort of rip the Band-Aid off, deal with everything that you haven't done, that you have promised people, so you can clear energy, so you have more mental space to then show up and start over again. So it's really this blockage of energy because people aren't taking care of it throughout the time of engagement with everybody.
Right.
I do think there is something to the, I don't know, the chronic nature of saying yes to things. And I think that, especially with the leaders, to your point, Kim, those conversations are not happening that says, if someone says, let's just say we're at the beginning of the year, let's say we're, talking about goals and we're allocating who's going to be accountable for certain things. If someone agrees to do it because they can, or maybe it's part of their job description or something, yet you can tell it's not really something they're excited about, or maybe their list is already 10 things long, there's not a conversation often that says, okay, I just said yes to 10 of the things. This seems like a lot. Can we think about how to reallocate? Or how do we think about we know we need to accomplish all of these things. How can we readjust the list so that I'm not taking on quite so much? But there's a whole lot of reasons why people probably don't do that. But I think that it starts with our, standing up for ourselves and realizing, we've seen this already this year when we start laying out people's plans for the year, and they're like, we'll get it done in January, we'll get it done in January, we'll get it done in January. And all of a sudden we're like, wait a minute, there's not enough days in the month to accomplish all of these things. And so you kind of already are setting yourself up, but then I don't know. So there's a lot there, I think, with that over committing piece.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we can help people tie that together with accountability, because I think we know people want to do a good job. People want to feel valued and be seen and all of those things. And so if we can, continually help them shrink the amount of things that they commit to and say yes to, they probably would be more responsible for executing on those things because they have more time and things like that. That seems like a virtuous cycle, but we are so far from that, I feel like.
It's so funny that we're talking about this. I had a conversation today with someone who committed to too many things and was tearful, that frustrated, right? And I said, what can you let go of? What can you reallocate, right? Because clearly there's just too much. And the response was, I made a commitment. I need to find a way. Like this is integrity, right? I committed, so I have to make it work. And I respect that, because I feel like we all have that of, we want to be our word, right? That's where I started, which is like, I'm my word. I have to do what I said. And I think that sometimes we don't give ourselves the grace to say, okay, ideally we would be filtering better when we're saying yes to things, right? That's obviously what we would hope to do, but we've all been in a situation where we find ourselves with too many things. If we don't take a step back and do exactly what you just suggested, Whitney, which is, how do I reallocate? How do I ask for help? How do I find someone who can, relieve some of this burden or switch tasks with me in some way to make this manageable, right? Because it takes a village. What we do is we end up putting things off or pushing them back or making ourselves really stressed out or, incapable of doing our best work, because obviously there are time limitations on everything. And so it doesn't end up serving anyone to be in that space. And yet it is a real challenge when we've committed, but we then figure out that we cannot deliver on what we've committed to. And culturally, we don't ask for help well in those situations. And we also don't backpedal well, because we look at it as a personal failure. And I guess I would like for people to realize that if that's a pattern all the time, sure, you probably need to adjust, your habits, but there's no shame and no harm in being like, whoa, I need to reallocate. I need to readjust. I need to figure this out, because it benefits you and literally everybody when you can do that.
Yeah. And then, you're so right. And in order to do that, I feel like the culture has to have a psychologically safe space where people
Yes.
are able to be vulnerable. Like to go to, like, if I committed to something, to say, Whitney, I'm going to get this done. And then I realize I can't get it done because maybe I don't have enough information. I don't know how to do it. I'm behind. I would need to trust you that you're not going to look down on me or yell at me or who knows what, right? If I come to you. So I think the deeper question is, are we creating a safe space for people to be able to do that? One. And then the other thing I want to add to that is, how we can help people and the way that I help my clients. And I also had someone today who was extremely overwhelmed because of commitments that she has made. And the question I always ask is, which priorities are moving the needle the fastest? What on your list is moving the boat the fastest? So when you look at the goals that you have for yourself, how much of it is just fluff, and can you backpedal and can you get rid of some of that? And how much is actually important? And so that's why the clarity piece in all of our work is so important, right? Is that when we know where we're trying to go, we know that the 80-20 rule, right? 20% of the things we do are going to get us 80% of the results that we have. So we really have to go back to some of that basic 101 stuff, right?
Right.
Because we tend to think, our brain loves to tell us that everything is important, that everything on the list, because we've made the commitments and but we have to get really, really honest with ourselves of what is actually important.
I think that is, I think part of what creates this emotional load on this is, I think if I'm feeling like I've said yes to too many things and I know I'm accountable to a lot of things and I may not be living up to my end of the bargain, it might be almost an outlet or a venting or backlash or something to say, well, you're not holding up your end or you're not accountable. And when you start to get into that where you're trying to put accountability on others or push accountability on others, that feels oppressive. It feels like I'm being micromanaged or that I'm micromanaging. It just feels negative. It doesn't feel good at all. And so I think that piece of it could be where some of the negativity is stemming from. But I also like you bringing up the vulnerability piece and the psychological safety piece, because I do think that what we're trying to build within these systems is this opportunity to speak more openly about things. I mean, all the leaders that we work with are high performing. They're all driven. They've all got incredible talents and gifts. And that's amazing qualities about all these people. Yet we find over and over and over that all of them are drowning. They've said yes. They have such a huge list of things on their plate continuously that it is so hard for them to say no, which I'm sure creates this culture. I've heard many leaders say, well, you know, I'm fine, but we need to have a culture of accountability. We need everyone else to be held accountable, which I don't like that. Accountability is one thing, but I want this person to be held accountable sounds awful to me. So I think that held accountable is probably worse than accountable accountability, because that's where I think we get into the, you know, it's not me, it's you, I guess, a little bit.
Well, you lose all autonomy the minute you're holding someone else accountable, right? Like it's no longer me responsible for me, it's someone else responsible for me. You know, that feels terrible. And I think that's where the idea of agency butts up against with accountability, right? Because if you're using the word agency, it's like, dude, leave me alone. I've got this. Let me be responsible for me. Don't tell me, you know, what I need to do and how I need to do it. And it's sort of like, I will take care of my, you know, my goals and my results, as opposed to this idea of I'm going to hold you accountable. I don't want somebody to hold me for, you know, for my performance. I want to be responsible for holding myself. I feel like that's what people want, is they want to feel like, you know, if you trust me to do the work, then please trust me to be responsible for seeing it all the way through and for making sure I do what I say I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. And that comes from clarity, right? So that people know what they're supposed to do.
Exactly. And this is where shared goals are really important. So, you know, one of the things that I teach through the flow coaching curriculum is being in flow as a team means you have shared goals, you have shared risks. So if that is in place, then the accountability is just going to come from taking responsibility for that, because we're already deciding, you know, these are the things we have to get done. And if we don't get them done, this is what's going to happen. So there's a little bit of risk. Then there's that purpose as a team, right? So there are certain triggers that can naturally trigger accountability that comes from a place of intrinsic motivation versus, you know, pointing fingers and blaming. So we really want to go and say, you know, from conscious leadership is say above the line, which is curiosity and kind of this questioning of like, what is happening? You know, what is going on? If you're not completing the task, what's misaligned, right? So really going in with these questions of, instead of saying you haven't done this, it's, you know, but why haven't you done this? What's not right? And how can we shift?
So I'm thinking about one, you know, what would be some little micro shifts that we could help people with this notion of accountability from a self accountability perspective, and maybe even the relationship to the word. And so as you were talking, I'm thinking about the getting curious, and I'm combining the two things that you've said on the call so far, is the psychological safety, like being in an environment of psychological safety, and then getting curious. And so me as a leader, let's take our example. So we've set our goals for the year. We've talked about, you know, different things that people are going to take responsibility for. But we also have that shared risk, like if these things don't happen. But I would want an environment where if you had something that you were going to do and you weren't able to for some strange reason or whatever, that you could come to me and say, I'm not going to hit this goal, but I know we need to hit it as a team. So how can we rethink that? And so I guess the micro shift for the leaders might be to maybe empathize. Oh my gosh, I'm so, you know, whatever is going on that is not allowing that to happen, and not shaming or blaming or anything negative like that, and getting curious about, well, why is that and what's going on? And, you know, what do you think we should do about it? And what are those questions that could be asked, as opposed to thinking about, well, now I don't know what to do because I was relying on this person to get this done and now they can't get it done. So instead, you know, using curiosity to solve for another way to do it. Because I love this notion that you're bringing up about, even though we each have individual things that we're responsible for, we're all in it together. It's all related. We're on a team. And so how do we, when things are not going as expected, which they tend to not ever go as expected, how do we, make it safe for people to raise their hand and say, hey, this is what's going on. But more importantly, how do we promote this curiosity? Because that might be one of the micro shifts that people could make that would maybe accelerate the safety piece. Do you think?
Yeah, and I always talk about being manager as coach, leader as coach, and that means just really taking a pulse into what is going on. And it could be things like the challenge skill balance is off. So they might have a goal that requires some skills and tasks to complete tasks, but there's the challenge is too high. So they might need more time to get that skill to be able to have that right balance of both, right? Because if you have too much challenge in any kind of task, we get stuck. We have to go out, we have to learn what we need to learn, right? And so really being an aware, conscious manager that regularly meets and asks these questions, saying, what is it that I can do for you to be able, what is it that you need from me to get this done? What do you think the problem is? Pause, right? Listening to their stream of consciousness and listening to what might be some blocks. Because as a coach, I love helping people individually, but what is really helpful is if the managers, if the leaders are also tuned in and are able to listen for those sabotaging blocks that happen out of curiosity.
One other thing I want to add too is that I think that when leaders demonstrate the very thing that they want to see in the organization themselves, that is also really powerful, right? And so, we see in our work, we see examples of leaders who are like, oh, that's great for everybody, right? I want everybody to do these things, or please feel free to, come to us if you have these issues or whatever. But the leader themselves doesn't show any vulnerability or doesn't follow the same thing, right? They're still sort of holding themselves above. And what we see is that people will be like, okay, I hear you, I hear the words, but it's still difficult for them to do the actions. But it can also be very powerful for a leader to say, you know what, things aren't going exactly the way that we had hoped. So we're going to have to take a second and recalibrate or readjust. And it's actually okay, right? We're going to come together and do this thing. And I think that's important too, for people to realize that I don't think people expect leaders to have all the answers all the time, but I do think people expect there to be transparency and genuine and authentic communication around whatever is going on. And I think that actually helps people feel safe to do the same. And so that to me would be another micro shift, is in addition to really listening and keeping a pulse and being open and curious, to also practice sort of what you're hoping to see, and do the same.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about, oddly, how it kind of summarizes our whole conversation today. But, the modeling piece is huge. So if I have an aversion to accountability based on whatever past experience or whatever has made this a loaded thing for me, I could potentially be inadvertently spreading that loaded or that negativity around the word. And so it's important to kind of understand, what you are modeling and what you are doing in relationship to this accountability. Because I just keep coming back to, I think it's in every single client we've ever had, accountability always comes up, whether it's self or throughout their organization. And so there's something about this that still isn't clear or isn't easily solved. And I think we've touched on, some of the micro shifts being, first of all, awareness, as we just talked about. Second of all, getting curious, and I think creating an environment where it's safe to, I'm thinking about safe to say no to certain things being a big piece of it. And that's where, Kim, as you were talking, that was what came to mind for me as a leader who's not saying yes to everything. And so therefore has an unmanageable list of things that they're accountable for, that could be a huge modeling opportunity for a ton of people. And I think that there's, I guess, a feeling that as the leader, you have to take on the most, or you have to say yes to everything or whatever. And I think that backfires, because it's not possible to do everything. And so we've got to Ariana's point, get clear on the priority, get clear on what we're trying to accomplish. And if we can whittle down the list, you can have more successes, you can achieve more. And I think to this group accountability notion, I think we're saying, if we're all in this together and we're dividing and conquering, we can go farther faster, basically. But I think that that's not typically the way we look at it. We do divide the goals, we do, separate things, but I don't know that we're going the extra step of saying, is that too much for each person? Does everyone have, to your point, the challenge and the skills? Is that right? And, do they have the time and everything else to do that? And so there's just a whole lot that goes into this. And I know we're going to have a lot more conversations about it, but I just love the idea that we're bringing this up. For anybody who is watching today, hopefully the couple of micro shifts they can take away immediately is really looking at what are you saying yes to? Is there anything that you're saying yes to that perhaps might be able to be reallocated somewhere else? Getting curious with others. I would advocate, and for yourself. I know, Ariana, you would say that too. Getting really curious with yourself about what you're saying yes to, and do you have too much on your plate if you're not able to achieve everything that's currently in front of you. And then the third thing is, I think the communication and being more transparent. I mean, I think this is a practice where if we can begin to introduce some of these things and start practicing it, it's building the muscles that hopefully will lead to group flow, greater self accountability, and achieving more results.